Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And so what we try to do is probably pick up patterns, right, and say, well, there's certain situations when I give myself negative messages.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Dr. Thomas Dunn, professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. Father Bacik and Dr. Dunn will discuss improving our inner dialogue. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Tom, I want to welcome you. I've thought of a good title for our program. The title is this: Can a liberal theologian successfully dialogue with a behaviorist psychologist? And we're going to make this experiment right now to see if we can actually speak together without getting...
if the behaviorist is a liberal behaviorist.
Well, that might make a difference. We're going to find that out. Anyway, I want to start and talk a little bit about some of the practices I would use in spiritual direction and talking to people about their religious and moral life. And then I'm hoping that leads us into something that I know you talk about and under the whole heading of self-talk. So let me begin by... sometimes people will come into me feeling bad about themselves. It might take a moral twist and a problem of scrupulosity. They might think that everything they do is really a sinful action, even when objectively speaking it isn't. People have very tender consciences sometimes. And sometimes people just generally have a poor self-image that's connected in with their religious training. So that somehow they've gotten this picture of a harsh and vengeful God, and that this God's going to punish them no matter what they do. So they will tell me about their problems and so on. And then one of the things that I will say to them is this: now I want you to listen carefully to me now. And I tell them, about God's love for them. The straight biblical message that God has sent His Son into the world because He loved the world, and that God holds us in the palm of His hand, that God exercises a maternal care for us, nourishes us, and nurtures us, and takes care of us, that God loves us, that God's a forgiving God, that He cares for us. And then I will talk to them all the biblical messages, the authentic part of the Christian tradition, slanted towards a positive understanding of God. And I say, now what I want you to do is sort of like put that on a cassette tape and play that in your head. Play that about 3 times a day. Try to remember my voice or hear my voice on that tape. And I said, what I want you to do is sort of get into the habit of thinking like that. So you don't need, after a while, the cassette tape, but you got your own voice that can tell you, no, I'm not sinful here because God's on my side. No, this isn't, I'm not a bad person because God loves me. So they have that sort of thing going on. Now, I'd like to use that as a springboard to talk a little bit about how the behaviorist might look at this whole idea of self-talk and so on.
Well, that's an excellent example that you provided of what we would call cognitive behavior modification. Traditional, well, we say traditional behavior mod. It's not that traditional. It really only started in the late 50s and the 60s, the use of behavioral principles in schools and therapy and counseling. But essentially based on principles, basic learning principles where, for example, if a behavior is followed by pleasant consequences, you're going to do it more often. If it's followed by something unpleasant, you do it less often. Very general.
So that's a general principle of behaviorist thought. And
exactly.
You try to reinforce good behavior by something pleasant, good happening after a particular behavior.
That's right.
Let's just give an example. I mean, a youngster... does well in their homework or gets a good grade, and you pay them a compliment.
Compliment, exactly.
Yeah.
Parents compliment kids for doing work around the house and things like that. And of course, that's not something that Skinner discovered. I mean,
people
do
when you say Skinner, you mean B.F. Skinner, connected with behaviorist psychology, yes.
Well, but to get to your example, the strict behavioral point of view didn't look at what people were thinking about too much. There's arguments about whether they thought it was important or not, but essentially a lot of people thought if you can't measure it, don't worry about it, we'll just deal with what's external. But over the last decade or so, there's been increasing interest with how people represent the world to themselves, so that you could think of an external event, object, situation, and then a person's reaction to that, stimulus response. But in between, we're paying increasing attention to how people represent that. What do people think about? So another way of looking at the basic behavioral issue is If people think that events and are going to be pleasant, they'll be more likely to do it. If people think that events or situations will be unpleasant, they'll try to avoid them.
So the development within the behavior school itself is to put more emphasis on the inner life, on what's going on psychically with the person. So you don't think just in terms of there's this external behavior that this child runs out in the street and that therefore the child gets spanked if it does that. But we want to begin to look more at what's happening in the psychic life, the inner life.
Include that also.
To include it in that,
exactly. Not to dispute or do away with the overt behaviors, but certainly now what we call mediating influences.
Right.
And it's just so obvious that we do that. In other words, how we represent the world to us then is going to determine how we behave. So the example you provided...
So somebody, just as an example, if somebody goes into a room and they think that people aren't going to like them, and then they're going to walk in defensively,
or they might not go into the room.
At all, right.
That's right, yeah.
So that perception they have that people will not like them influences their behavior. They would not be as effervescent or outgoing, and that therefore, as a matter of fact, that people might not notice them or deal well with them.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, yeah.
Is exactly what happens to a lot of them.
Right.
In the example you provided where the individual was self-critical based on, I forget the term you used, it was a terrific term.
Scrupulosity.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a term from moral theology, that's people who put undue weight on faults and make them into sins. They manufacture sins. Mm-hmm. They think they do sinful things even when, objectively speaking, it is not. It's a known syndrome and heavily found, I suppose, wherever you have a moralistic kind of teaching and repressive authority figures and heavy images of God.
So I think you were right in assuming that you were recommending play this pleasant cassette. On the other hand, if we could only hold up a microphone and pick up what they're thinking to themselves, we'd probably find that person throughout the day making very many self-critical statements. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm a bad person. Oh, this is bad. No one's going to like me. God doesn't love me and all that stuff. And if a person has that, clinically speaking, if a person has that many self-critical remarks, it takes its toll on that individual and usually leads to what we call depression.
Now, how would you, as a therapist, how would you begin to uncover that? You would just look for that as someone told their story, or would you have a series of questions that you would ask that would try to uncover what were you feeling while that went on, or what were you thinking while you engaged in that behavior?
You'd very often structure situations where the person, you would ask the person in a session, what are you thinking about? What happened between the time that you did this and between the time the person said something to you. In other words, the person says something and then you react. And in between, what were you thinking about?
Yeah.
And very often people don't know how to do that too well, so you can structure a situation, role-play a situation.
And let them practice that.
Yes, but also just tell them, like homework, literally, I want you to now keep track of what you think about in these situations.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose it would be good even to have them write it down, huh?
Oh, so exactly, yes. Now, for real serious cases, which I really don't deal with, but for real serious cases, they're probably not able to do that. But typically for the person who just is unhappy, for example, and what we call slight depression, they're able to keep track of the kinds of self-statements they might catch themselves saying. Mm-hmm. And we've all seen examples of this. It's the kind of person that if they're really down, you pay them a compliment, and what they're saying to themselves is, he didn't really mean that.
Right.
Or if he really knew the real me, he wouldn't be saying those nice things to me.
He would never say it, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And now we all do that from time to time. The person who does that quite often obviously leads to what we call, the symptoms of depression.
Mm-hmm. And now this, even to go back a little bit further, is based on the notion that we all do carry on an inner dialogue. That there's something that happens that way. We talk to ourselves, not out loud. That's an interesting phenomenon in itself. Do the behaviors have sort of a theory of that, or who's talking to whom, or what parts of ourselves are talking to other parts? Is that...
No, I don't think they worry about parts, but certainly it's behavior, subvocal speech it's often called. And it is, if you want to treat it as strict a strict behavioral way, you could say, well, those behaviors, whether we can see them or not, are susceptible to reinforcement strategies just the same as anything else.
Therefore, you know they exist.
That's
because
right.
they are...
But you have to depend on the person to tell you that.
Right.
See, and that's an influence that certainly loosened up the boundaries between a strict behavioral approach and other approaches.
Yeah.
So it really has.
So you want them to become more aware of what's happening in this inner dialogue. That's my phrase. I realize that captures what you're talking about, I think.
Yes.
When they are speaking to themselves, in a sense. So what we try to do is probably pick up patterns, right? And say, well, there's certain situations when I give myself negative messages. You know, I'm standing over this putt and I'm telling myself I'll never make this putt,
right,
and there's a good chance I'm not going to make it.
I'm going to screw up. I'm really going to do a bad job.
That's a lot. I think of. I'm reminded of the point of momentum in sports. That I think very often what happens is people are telling themselves positive messages. I mean, a guy gets a couple of hits, and then he starts telling himself, I'll go up there and I can get a hit next time, and then you are more confident and you have a better chance you can get the hit. I noticed Larry Bird talking about the NBA playoffs along that line. He says a year before, they thought when they were going to play Houston, the Boston Celtics, that they had won so many times and won in the playoffs, they just went in thinking they were not beatable. And he says he figures that Los Angeles is in that situation when they go through all of that.
Well, sports psychology is looking at those issues in self-talk. And good coaches now promote that positive self-talk, I can do it, or actual positive self-image, too, imagining yourself behaving the appropriate way.
Yeah, now, does that raise something new, Tom, here, when you bring in the image question as opposed to the speech? For example, I'm telling the person, remember now, God loves you, and there's a whole positive biblical message I want you to be repeating to yourself. There would be another thing to work on it from the image viewpoint. Now, just let me tell you how I often just intuitively do this in spiritual direction or trying to help people with religious, ethical problems. That is, I would get them to imagine positive scenes. And I would tell them to try to put themselves in a situation where they performed well or were well accepted by another person. And I try to get them to feel it, to imagine whether the sun was out or not, how their skin felt, whether it was warm or cold, the emotions that they felt when the other person was kind to them or they performed well. So I try to get them to put themselves in that scene quickly and with great imagination. And I would suggest that they sort of get a repertoire of 3 or 4 such positive scenes and replay them throughout the day. And then I always try to get them to link it to prayer, like to talk to God about that. God, thank you for that person who I love so much, or thank you for the beauties of nature that came across to me there, or I praise you for your goodness in that situation. I try to get them to link the imagination with this positive religious notions as well, figuring that becomes a more powerful mix. So I guess what I'm raising is are we dealing with the same phenomenon here, or do we bring in a new dimension when we start talking about imagination?
Well, I think it's both. We don't really know if we can treat images and self-talk in the same exact way, but it's clear they're both covert. And so the strategies in cognitive behavior mod include both. In fact, the example you provide, I'll give it a psychological definition, is called covert conditioning. Now, you didn't know that you were doing that.
Yeah, covert conditioning. And what
those sounds like a very harsh term.
The conditioning word makes sense to me. When you say covert, you're meaning...
You can't see it. It's in the mind.
I see. That's the behaviorist way to speak about this reality. I might talk about it in the inner dialogue or the psychic life or the imagination, as we talked about.
The strict behaviorists would say their behaviors anyway.
Yeah.
And in fact, covert conditioning, they are treated exactly that way. In other words, you can, if you imagine yourself, well, for example, in teaching, we often have examples of students might want to be better at studying, or a good example is giving a speech before a group.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the classic strategy is you have somebody imagine doing that. Now, if they can't actually get up, if they feel too stressed to get up and do it, they might be able to imagine doing it. So it's all covert. They can imagine themselves, and just like you said, imagine being up in front of a group, imagine yourself being really successful, imagine the audience looking at you and really being interested. decorate the room. What would it feel like? What would it look like? So what you try to do is approximate reality to the extent that you can without really being there. Then you view yourself as being successful, and you could also imagine yourself being reinforced for doing so. So it runs the whole cycle, but it's totally in your mind.
Yes, and then so you end up then hoping that this has a carryover when you're in the real situation.
That's right.
That some of these positive images will come to you, that you'll have a bit of confidence, that you'll perform well, and that there will be positive feedback from this good performance, right?
And it turns out there's some data to suggest that, but there's also a lot of folklore too. We all think, we've all often heard people say that be careful what you think or imagine yourself to be because you're going to be that way. Well, and we can turn that around in a positive way. If you want to be something, then imagine yourself doing it.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to avoid the unpleasant, promote the pleasant images, and then hopefully you're more likely to do it. You can speak in just from probabilities, meaning you're more likely to be successful at something if you imagine yourself being successful.
Yeah, and that goes back to that sports imaging again, which a lot of people talk about. And there's certain golf coaches that want you to do that. They want you to get not so swing oriented, but target oriented. And so they say, imagine the shot going right to the target. And then the theory is that your swing will function in such a way as to get the ball to do that. That if you can relax yourself and let your muscle memory take over and so on, that it'll work that way. I've never found that to be terribly successful myself because there's all that bad muscle memory in there that takes over in this imagining.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences with golf and bowling and things like that.
But it does work for some people, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Well, they say it does, and there's people who have done some research on that to suggest there's some influence. It's very difficult to get hard data on that stuff. But anecdotal data abounds. I mean, the coaches
people will say that,
yes. And, well, Jack Nicklaus, the famous golfer, believes in that. He practices that inner golf strategy.
Yes. I remember Arnold Palmer writing about that many years ago, even going out to the golf course. I think this was before it was all popular, but talking about imagining good shots as you drove out to the golf course, and that was a good way to start preparing yourself and to think that you could do it.
But we're talking about the same thing with an emphasis on positive thoughts or positive self-statements. The area or the emphasis is on the positive.
Right.
So to get back to what you were saying, you were providing an example of someone who's overwhelmed with negative self-statements. And it's going to take its toll. And so to the extent that you can reverse that, and some people just need to be taught it first and be encouraged to practice it.
I remember one of these self-help books, and the title of it is Feeling Good, and the author is something like Brown or Bowen. Does it ring a bell? Shouldn't have brought it up if I didn't remember the author. I can't zero in on it. I thought maybe you would know the book. But, I mean, anyway, in there, he tries to isolate various types of faulty thinking along this line. And a good example of that would be to universalize when you shouldn't. So you go through a day and you do one bad thing, and you end up saying, I'm a bad person. Now, that's a logical flaw, because when you do one bad thing, it doesn't mean you're a bad person.
That's right.
So what he tries to get people to do is to recognize this, that I have a pattern of universalizing my bad behavior. Because I didn't do well on this exam, I won't do well on any exam. And so he wants you to write that down and begin to identify that faulty thinking whenever it comes up, so that you begin to check yourself. There I am, universalizing from insufficient data.
Yes, and people can do that.
Yeah.
When you first bring that up to them, they say, well, I don't know what I'm thinking. I won't be able to do that. What are you talking about? That's automatic. But they can if be taught to recognize, and they literally do what you say. Oh, my God, that's an example.
Yeah.
And then they write it down.
Right.
Ellis is another...
That's the name that goes with this whole...
Rational emotive therapy.
Right, yeah.
Where he categorizes classic examples of inappropriate self-talk. And awfulizing is another term used.
What does that mean?
Well, everything's awful. I mean, if something happens, oh my God, it's the worst possible thing that ever happened. Or that everybody should love me, or I should be good at everything I do.
Now that's a slant to it that maybe bears further conversation. That everyone should love me, or I expect to be liked by everyone.
Right, that's right.
Now that is a statement that doesn't accord with reality.
Precisely.
Yeah, and therefore that will put you into a dream world and make you excessively upset because there will be a certain amount of people who won't like you no matter how good you are.
That's right. Every day you're going to meet people who don't particularly like you.
Yeah.
But yet if you feel that everybody should. Now, the interesting thing about that's a belief statement, and I don't know how much time we have, but you can talk about three different kind of self-talk. One is a self-statement, where I would tell myself, oh, you did really badly, and you're no good. That kind of self-talk people can pick up fairly easily.
Okay.
When you ask them. Another was kind of a classification decision, which is a little bit more difficult, and that is when people come upon an event and they classify it. For example, if someone is going to a party, a husband and wife are going to a party, and the husband says, well, it's an office party, and the wife may not like going to these, and she says, oh, it's another one of those.
I see.
All right. She makes a classification decision. She no longer needs to think anything about it, but tucked in long-term memory is a script to follow.
Right.
Because she, in a sense, classified.
So
and
she's going to be unhappy through this whole evening.
That's right.
No matter what happens.
Classified it. That's right. Oh my God, it's one of those.
Yeah.
And
so that's a second type of self-talk that goes on.
That's right. Harder to pick up.
Yeah.
And the most difficult is a belief statement, which is what we were just talking about a moment ago, where if a person believes that everybody should love me. See, that the person may not say at all to himself or herself, but they do behave accordingly.
And that is much more subtle.
It's much more subtle.
In other words, in this case, what the therapist has to do, or anyone who's trying to help anybody else, is to enable people to pick this up.
Yes, and you have to literally pump away at that if it's a belief statement, because you almost have to make an inference based on a person's reaction to certain events. And then test it out and feel it out.
Yeah, because they won't be able to articulate it
That's
usually.
Right, yeah. And they'll say, well, I didn't think of anything. And they may be right. Because it may have just been an instantaneous recognition, and it went against their implied belief.
Yeah. But I would think that there's certain very common ones along this line of these beliefs that maybe one could try out on people. Well, after you listen to a person's story, even though they don't articulate that, you might well pick up the sort of thing, well, geez, this person expects everyone to like her.
That's right.
And then you try that out on her, and say, well, does that make sense or not? I mean, do you really feel like that?
And very often you can get at that. Another one is that I should be perfect at everything I do, or everything I do should be perfect. And people will not admit to that, but they often behave that way. And then, see, what happens is they actually have a dichotomy. If it's not perfect, then it's absolutely the worst thing on earth.
Yeah.
And see, there's no possible way that a person like that can be happy, because they cannot do everything perfectly. And then because it's not perfect, the only other category left for them is terrible.
It's terrible, yeah.
Then they're going to be unhappy.
That's well put, yeah. Tom, we need to talk about how positively we're going to help with this situation. How are we going to improve our self-talk and make our inner dialogue work better for us?
Well, the first part of that is what we were primarily talking about so far, is the recognition.
First step is recognition. So we got to see when our inner talk is hurting us, when it's negative and out of touch with reality, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And then there are various other strategies, but basically we could lump it under the idea that you can test out whether there's reality to these self-statements. And then if a person says everything's terrible, or I have no fun in life, that you actually get them to test that out. Well, tell me, did you have a good time? I mean, did you enjoy going to the Tiger game? Oh, yeah, it was good. Well, then you were wrong, because you said you never have any fun, you see. So that kind of dialogue can go on. Another...
and you try to get the person and almost call them up short, don't you? You got to, almost cut through this habitual way of perceiving things negatively.
Yes, based on data they had to collect.
Right. It just isn't right. You were just wrong in saying that.
That's right. That's
and you got to see that. You got to recognize that. And now you got to make another step. You got to start to get your thinking, your perceiving more in line with reality.
Right.
You did enjoy the ball game. You almost got to get them to admit it.
That's right. Yes, depends on who won, of course.
Yeah, right.
But there's most of the examples we're talking about